The Revolutionary War, the conflict that forged the United States into the amazing, lovable country we know it as today. Last week we talked about the War of 1812, which acts as a sequel of sorts to this war. So it makes sense we talk about the main event. What were things like before the Revolution? What led to the conflict? What happened during it? And ultimately, what were the results and legacy of the Revolutionary War? That's what today's historical history documentary is all about. Now let's dive in. Before we get to the heart of the conflict, let's address the American colonies and how they came to be. The 13 colonies were founded over the course of more than a century, beginning with Virginia in 1607 and ending with Georgia in 1732. Each developed under its own charter and conditions. New England's colonies were often shaped by religious communities like the Puritans, while the middle colonies thrived on trade and diversity, and the southern colonies built plantation economies tied to enslaved labor. Though they differed in culture and economy, all were tied to Britain through trade, law, and the protection of the crown, a connection that would eventually be tested to breaking point. In the decades before the Revolutionary War, life in the 13 colonies carried the rhythms of growth and prosperity. From New England's rocky coasts to the plantations of the South, the colonies had developed distinct regional identities, yet shared a sense of belonging to a greater British world. They traded in British markets, read British newspapers, and toasted the king in taverns. Local assemblies governed most daily affairs, and a measure of autonomy allowed the colonists to feel both independent and loyal. Many families were only a generation or two removed from Britain, still speaking in familiar accents and holding on to old world customs. But beneath this shared identity, a quiet shift was taking place. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as it was known in America, had redrawn the map of North America. Britain's victory expelled France from Canada and lands east of the Mississippi, ending a centuries-long rivalry. This brought security, but also new problems. The war had been expensive, leaving Britain with a crushing debt. And now, without the French threat, the colonies seemed less dependent on British protection. Parliament, seeking to tighten its grip and recoup its losses, began looking across the Atlantic, not with the eyes of a benevolent protector, but with the calculations of a tax collector. What had been a partnership was slowly becoming a relationship defined by control. The colonies would soon find out that their version of loyalty was not the same as Britain's. The first visible crack appeared in 1763 with the King's proclamation forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British government hoped to prevent costly conflicts with native nations, but for colonists eager to claim land in the fertile Ohio Valley, it felt like a betrayal of the freedom they had fought for in the recent war. Then came the taxes. The Sugar Act of 1764 lowered duties on molasses, but enforced them strictly, cutting into colonial trade. The Stamp Act of 1765 went further, requiring that newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, bear an official stamp purchased from Britain. This wasn't just about money. The principles stung. Parliament was taxing British subjects who had no representation in Parliament itself. The slogan rang out, "No taxation without representation," not just in Boston, but in ports and towns from Georgia to New Hampshire. Tensions between Boston's citizens and the occupying British troops had been simmering for years. Since 1768, redcoats had been stationed in the city to enforce unpopular customs duties, a constant reminder of Parliament's authority. To many Bostonians, the soldiers were not protectors, but intruders, competing for jobs, disrupting daily life, and occasionally provoking street confrontations. By early March 1770, resentment had reached a boiling point. On the cold night of March 5th, a crowd of colonists confronted a small group of soldiers outside the customs house. Snowballs, ice, and insults flew through the air. Amid the chaos, a musket discharged. Whether by accident or command remains debated, and the other soldiers followed suit. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent who would become one of the first martyrs of the Revolution. The event was quickly seized upon by Patriot leaders as proof of British tyranny. Within days, engraver Paul Revere produced his now famous depiction of the scene, neatly lined redcoats firing in unison at an unarmed, orderly crowd. While historically inaccurate, the image became one of the most effective pieces of propaganda in American history, spreading anger and sympathy throughout the colonies. The soldiers stood trial in Boston, with John Adams, future president, defending them to uphold the principle of fair justice. Most were acquitted, but the political damage to Britain was done. The Boston Massacre was not the largest loss of life in the struggle for independence, but it was a turning point in public opinion, transforming local unrest into a cause that could unite the colonies against what they now saw as an occupying power. By 1773, Britain's grip on colonial trade had tightened, and one commodity became the flashpoint: tea. Parliament's Tea Act allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price, bypassing colonial merchants. On the surface, it made tea cheaper, but to Patriot leaders, it was a trap, a way to get colonists to accept the principle that Parliament could tax them without their consent. In Boston, resentment boiled over. On the night of December 16th, members of the Sons of Liberty, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, slipped onto 3 ships anchored in the harbor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Working in disciplined silence, the men pried open 342 chests and dumped their contents into the icy water, destroying nearly 90,000 pounds of tea, worth a fortune in today's money. Crowds gathered along the wharves, watching as the harbor turned dark with leaves. The protest was bold, theatrical, and unmistakable, a direct challenge to British authority. London's response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, good burn, guys, which closed Boston Harbor and placed Massachusetts under tighter control. Far from crushing dissent, the punishment only united the colonies further, bringing them one step closer to revolution. And seriously, if you want to send a message to a British person, fuck with their tea. Do it, I dare you. By 1774, colonial leaders convened the First Continental Congress. For the first time, representatives from nearly every colony sat down to coordinate their resistance. The idea of a united colonial identity, once faint, was now beginning to take shape. The Revolutionary War began in the early morning of April 19, 1775, in the small towns of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. British troops had been ordered to seize colonial weapons hidden in Concord. Local militia, ordinary farmers and tradesmen, stood in their way. A single shot, whose origin is still debated, rang out. It became known as the shot heard round the world. The battles that followed marked the point of no return. At Bunker Hill that June, colonial forces entrenched themselves on high ground outside Boston. The British stormed the position, eventually taking it, but at the cost of over 1,000 casualties. The message was clear: the colonies would not go quietly. It's almost as if invading a country where people know the land and how to utilize it is a bad idea. Good thing America learned this lesson early on. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Tall, composed, and already a veteran of the French and Indian War, Washington brought unity to a ragtag collection of militias. By March 1776, with heavy cannons hauled from Fort Ticonderoga, Washington forced the British to evacuate Boston entirely. But the fight was far from over. That summer, Britain struck back with a massive invasion of New York. Washington's army suffered a series of defeats, retreating through New Jersey in the face of overwhelming force. Yet in the bitter cold of Christmas night, 1776, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River, surprising Hessian mercenaries at Trenton and winning again at Princeton. These victories breathed new life into the American cause. In 1777, the American triumph at Saratoga proved decisive. British General Burgoyne's surrender convinced France to openly join the war, bringing naval power, supplies, and soldiers. Take that, King George! You smug son of a bitch. When Britain committed its army to suppressing the rebellion, it entered a war unlike any it had fought before. Trained for set-piece battles in open fields, British forces were used to meeting an enemy who would stand in line and trade volleys until one side broke. In America, the terrain itself became a weapon. Thick forests, winding rivers, and sprawling countryside gave colonial fighters the advantage of choosing when and where to strike. Militia units could vanish into the woods after an ambush, melt back into local communities, and reappear miles away before the British could respond. Even supply lines, stretching across the Atlantic and deep into unfamiliar territory, became vulnerable targets. In the South especially, patriot partisans like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, perfected hit-and-run tactics. They would strike isolated British outposts or supply trains, then disappear into swamps and backcountry trails known only to locals. For the Redcoats, chasing them was a costly and often futile effort. These unconventional tactics not only bled British forces over time, but also sapped their morale, forcing them to divert troops away from major campaigns to deal with what they saw as an invisible enemy. The British Army may have been the most disciplined fighting force in the world, but in the American wilderness, discipline and drill could not easily overcome a foe who fought on his own terms. By 1781, the British Army under General Cornwallis found itself trapped at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington's forces, with French troops under Rochambeau and a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, closed in. After 3 weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. Major combat was over and the path to independence was open. Although Yorktown ended the fighting, the war was not yet officially over. Negotiations dragged on in Europe, where diplomacy moved at a slower pace than musket fire. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States as a free and independent nation, ceding all territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from Canada in the north to Spanish Florida in the south. The treaty also addressed fishing rights off Newfoundland, repayment of debts, and the treatment of loyalists, though, in reality, many loyalists faced hostility and were forced to flee. Tens of thousands resettled in Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean, carrying with them memories of a war that had divided neighbors, families, and entire communities. For the new United States, independence was both a triumph and a test. Without the unifying threat of British rule, the states now had to find a way to govern themselves, a challenge that would soon lead to debates over the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution. And we have a video on the Articles of Confederation if you're curious, and we'll probably do one on the Constitution at some point. The Revolutionary War was more than a colonial rebellion. It was a global turning point. the United States became the first large-scale republic of the modern era, proving that monarchy was not the only form of government capable of stability and success. Its ideals, liberty, representation, and the belief that government exists by the consent of the governed, resonated far beyond its borders. The French Revolution drew inspiration from the American example, as did the Haitian Revolution and independence movements across Latin America. Yet the revolution's legacy was complicated. The same principles that fueled independence were not extended to everyone. Enslaved people remained in bondage, Native American lands were encroached upon, and women were largely excluded from political life. And while some efforts have been made to correct these injustices, we still have a long way to go. Militarily, the war demonstrated that determination, adaptability, and strategic alliances could overcome superior numbers and resources. Diplomacy, especially the alliance with France, proved just as critical as battlefield victories. Today, the revolution is remembered both as a war for independence and as the beginning of an ongoing journey toward the ideals it proclaimed. The promise of liberty and equality, first declared in those years of struggle, continues to challenge each new generation to live up to it. And that's all I have to say to you. Why are you still here? Go away. Oh, before you do, sorry. Can you like this video and leave a comment? Perhaps you were around during the Revolutionary War and have memories to share. I mean, if you do, then I would hope you would also share your research on time travel, as such a device would make doing these videos a piece of cake. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.